Right, good evening. I think we'll get a start and just assume that we may have some people still trying to figure out where the Humanities Lecture Theater is in the Gilbert Scott Building. So welcome to the first of two special Stevenson Trust post-election events that we are putting on. I'm Christopher Carman. I'm the Stevenson Professor of Citizenship here at the university. The Stevenson Trust was founded in 1921 with a gift to the university by Sir Daniel Stevenson. Sir Daniel was especially concerned about the strength of our civic institutions and the role people play in supporting and maintaining those institutions. So the Stevenson Trust was tasked with supporting public knowledge, public education on matters of citizenship, and thereby strengthening the position of the citizenry in the political system. So tonight, we'll look to rise to our remit, first through bringing together our leading experts on Scottish politics to discuss the Parliament election and its implications, and I will come around to introducing them in a moment. First, though, the other thing that we are doing tonight is announcing the launch of the first Scottish election analysis report, which I'm supposed to. It's not working properly. All right, I'll just do this. Right. So this is a report that we've put together. It has 55 short, engaging articles by 75 leading scholars of Scottish politics and media. The articles are written to offer cutting-edge analysis that is both rigorous and provides some commentary on the recent Scottish elections across 5 topical sections. I mean, I'm sure we will come around to talking about this. This was a particularly remarkable election in many ways in the result, if not the rather less than inspiring campaign. We ended up with the 5th consecutive SNP government. We end up with 2 parties tied for second place. We end up with turnout sort of going back to pre-COVID really levels, I should say, instead of pre-referendum levels. And we end up with almost half of the parliament being newly elected members. So a particularly remarkable election in its outcome. So what the election analysis report does is breaks into 5 sections across different themes: parties in the campaign, media, news and journalism, voters' polls and the electoral system, democracy and representation, and particularly something new for this series, policy implications of this report. So this report does fit within a long-standing series of election analysis reports that's put on by University of Bournemouth colleagues, and we do thank them very much for their support in putting this together. They offered a lot of assistance to us in figuring out how to go about doing this, and so we do acknowledge and thank them for their support. It's free report. It's available to download with this QR code, or I think you have a few leaflets around. We hope that it does inform public debate about the future of politics, policy, the shape of our political institutions, and where we're going politically as a country in Scotland. Particularly, we hope that it's a resource for educators in the classroom. These are sort of accessible, publicly accessible articles in this report, and so we can imagine that it should provide lively debate in classrooms. And if we can help out on that in any way, please do let us know. I should say, by just glancing around, I suspect about a quarter of the people in this room actually are authors on this report. And so I did want to say that in addition to thanking the colleagues at the University of Bournemouth and thanking Political Studies Association for supporting this, we also want to thank the people who contributed their time, effort, analysis to the report. So thank you to everybody who participated in putting this together. With that, I will actually then switch to announcing our speakers for this evening, Wait, so there we go. Oh, that's right. I did intend to say this. The second event that we're putting on, I said there would be two post-election events. The second one is on the 2nd of June coming up. And that will be Professor Ailsa Henderson returning with more of our Scottish election study colleagues. Right now, our post-election survey is in the field. And so hopefully by the 2nd of June, we'll have the full data sets. So we can provide the cutting edge analysis and sort of really say a bit more about how the public engaged with the election. So, right, I think that's all the items of business on that. So I'll turn to introducing our panelists for this evening. I will say Professor Meryl Kenny had to pass in her apologies. Something unavoidable came up, so unfortunately she couldn't make it. With that, I'll sort of slot in her spot and wing it. So wish me luck. The people who won't be winging it, Professor Ailsa Henderson. Professor Henderson is Professor of Political Science at the University of Edinburgh and Principal Investigator of the Scottish Election Study. That's the long-running academic project that tracks Scottish political attitudes and voting behavior. She has published widely on national identity, electoral behavior, and political culture in Scotland and beyond, and was awarded the University of Edinburgh's Tamdale Prize for Excellence in Public Engagement. And if anyone can tell us what Scottish voters were actually thinking on the 7th of May, it's Ailsa, because she did spend about 13 hours at the BBC studio at Pacific Quay practicing for tonight's event. So thank you, Ailsa, for making it. And then we have Professor Nicola McEwen. Professor McEwen is Professor of Public Policy and Governance and the Director of the Centre for Public Policy at the University of Glasgow. I'd encourage you, just as an aside, to look at the Centre's website because they put on, I don't even know how many webinars and events and briefings. Quite a few. Put on quite a few events in the run-up and since the election, so it's a good resource for those. Professor McEwen has published widely in the field of territorial politics, nationalism, and multi-level government and public policy making. Tonight, brings her expertise to a question that looms over the new parliament. What does a fifth SNP government, we heard that John Swinney has now been confirmed again as First Minister today. So this new fifth SNP government without a majority, facing a populist opposition, what does that mean for the future of Scottish self-government? So we'll each offer our thoughts briefly, and then we will turn over to discussion with everyone here. So with that, first I will turn over to you, Ailsa, and I think it is now working. Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. Thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. I should say for all of the academics in the room, the Scottish Election Study doesn't just poll before and after Scottish elections and UK elections. We also poll several times during the year, and we always reserve survey space for academics who are interested in posing questions on our questionnaire. If you are interested in asking questions, then please do get in touch with us. There's always space reserved. There's also ring-fenced space for early career researchers. So if you want to know what people in Scotland think and you don't think that we've provided a satisfactory answer, then perhaps you have a better question that we can put to people. I'm going to talk very briefly. These are just to get us started, and because I was so happy that Boundary Line released the data on the new boundaries, these are maps of change in party support. I've left off the Greens for obvious reasons. So it runs SNP, Labour, Conservatives, Lib Dems, and Reform. And the darker the colour, the better the result. In the case of the SNP, the yellower the colour, the better the result. There are huge caveats around these maps, and I would draw your attention to the middle one, to the Conservatives. So darker colour is better. Darker colour implies the Conservatives did better in Shetland and Orkney relative to other parts of Scotland. But of course, they had mid-single digits in 2021, and they ended up on low single digits in 2026. But in the wider context of how the Conservatives were doing in mainland Scotland. Actually, it looks like not a bad performance in Orkney and Shetland. But I think perhaps, so I just put these up as a starter, but perhaps to get us started, it's useful to look at how the election compares to previous ones. We can measure it in terms of how fractured the party system was. So if we add up party vote for the top three parties, the three previous elections, those three parties were hitting about 90% of the vote. In this election, they were at 73% of the vote. The average winning share needed to take a constituency reduced from 49% in 2021 to 42% in 2026. That's the effect of having an additional party competing for seats. But we can also see the effect of having an additional party in terms of how disproportional the election results have been, and also in terms of how volatile the election has been. So disproportionality, the relationship between percentage of votes and percentage of seats. Volatility, how much change we have seen on average across parties. That's a map of volatility up there. You can see the effect of Fergus Ewing standing as an independent with the fact that there are particularly volatile results up in Inverness. What is also helpful is to look at changing patterns of split ticket voting. We had an increase in split ticket voting on our preliminary data. Why? Well, we know that some of that is being driven by decisions about tactical voting. We also know that some of the split ticket decisions seem to be tied to lower levels of attachment to parties. And there's multiple ways to look at this. In the pre-election survey, we had a party likability measure, so a thermometer measure on how much people liked the parties. Those who split their ticket, in other words, those who backed different parties in the constituency and the list, tended to have lower levels of affection or likability scores for their parties than those who did not split their tickets. We also know about, thank you, about levels of tactical voting. This is a trend graph in terms of what we knew about tactical voting over the course of all the devolved elections from 1999. And we had reached a point in 2021 where 1/5 of all votes cast were tactical votes. We know that most of those tactical votes were votes cast against the SNP, so an effort to stop the SNP from winning a constituency contest. We don't yet have the read from the post data that would allow us to compare to what we would have here for the previous elections, but we have some indications that we're looking roundabout at the same levels. So when we polled on this in February, we had 15% on tactical voting. By April, that had risen slightly to 18. We're still waiting the final figure. What we do know, though, is that the nature of tactical voting has changed slightly. And so what I've done here is I've explained the party that people are trying to stop based on the party that they actually preferred in the constituency ballot. And what you can see is that an effort to stop the SNP is still most of the tactical voting that's happening in Scotland. But we can also see, particularly for those who really prefer the SNP and who prefer the Greens, that the bulk of that tactical vote is actually an anti-reform tactical vote. And an anti-reform tactical vote is also present to a considerable amount among those who prefer Labour and the Lib Dems. So tactical voting, the levels seem the same as before, but the nature of it is slightly different than we had before. Thank you. We know obviously about vote switching. Now we had new constituency boundaries in many of the constituencies. So when we look at change from 2021, we're actually looking at change from notional calculations, what those results would have been had those constituency boundaries existed in 2021. But for these, we're looking at changes from self-reported data from 2021 to 2026. And I don't know why the colors on that screen are not the same as the colors that are on that screen, but you can follow the labels and see what's happening. So we see a considerable amount of switching, right? But one thing I wanted to do was look at, well, what's actually going on in terms of this switching? If we look at the party that you left, how do you feel about your departed party based on where you went? So some people who switch to new parties might be more likely to come back, but some people who switch to other parties might have found a happy home and actually have a very dim view of the party that they used to support. So if we look at the patterns there, we can see among those who left the Conservatives, they still retain fairly healthy scores on that likability score on 0 to 10 for their departed Conservative Party. So if you stayed with the Conservatives, you have a 7.5 score on a scale of 0 to 10 for the Conservatives. If you left to go to Labour or to go to the Lib Dems or to go to Reform, you're still retaining scores of affection for your party at 5 or above. But if you compare that to some of the other parties, you can see that there's much more variation in terms of your scores for your departed party based on where you went. And the long and the short of it is, if you were a Conservative voter and you left the Conservatives to vote Reform, you retain a fairly healthy view of your old party. If you were voting for Labour or Lib Dems and SNP and you left for Reform, you have much dimmer views of your former party. And that's important because it suggests that they are less likely to return. And so if we look at the patterns here, we can see people who left the SNP to vote for Greens, they still retain a positive view of the SNP. They might well come back, but they are less likely to come back if they went for Reform. And I can talk more about that later if that's helpful. Next one, please. Just to help understand the demographics of the vote, these are ordered from oldest members of the data set to youngest members of the data set to oldest members of the data set, and it alternates between men and women for each of those age categories. And so what you can see is where the percentage support is, and you can look to see whether those bars have any kind of an angle to them to see if there's an important age profile in support. And if we look at this, we can see that Greens are drawing predominantly from younger members of the electorate, less so from older members. We see a slightly opposite age profile in terms of Reform and Conservatives, but it's a starker one for Conservatives in particular, because there is so little support for the Conservatives among younger members of the electorate. It's a bit flatter, and one might argue healthier, if we're looking at parties like Labour, for example. Another way to look at the same information, and Chris tells me there's way too much going on in here, but I think I can talk you through it. Right. So what we've got here are the figures. The figures are anchored on how that demographic group voted for that party in 2021. And if you're on the left of the line, then your party was losing support among that demographic group. And if you're on the right of the line, your party was gaining demographic support among that, demographic group. Again, it's ordered from youngest to oldest. So if we look at the SNP, we can see that there is an angle on that. There's an age profile to the departures. They are losing predominantly younger voters, but particularly they're losing the support of women. If we're looking at Labour, it's a slightly flatter age profile. If we're looking at the Conservatives, notwithstanding the behaviour of the youngest male members of our data set, they are losing particularly older levels of support, particularly male older supporters. So those are the ones who were losing demographic support in this election. And on the other side of this is people who were winners, who were gaining support among these different demographic groups. It's a fairly age curve on that for the Lib Dems. But if we look at Greens and we look at Reform, we see slightly different pictures. We see that Greens were particularly gaining support among the youngest members of the electorate, particularly so among young women, where there was a plus 36-point change in support for the Greens among that demographic group, so the youngest female members of the data set. With Reform, it's a slightly different profile. They are gaining particularly from older members of the data set, and there's a slight advantage for men over women. So we've got those who were losing among demographic groups, those who were gaining among demographic groups. It's not a straight change. It's not exactly that the older members who left the Conservatives have gone immediately over to Reform. And it's not necessarily that the younger members of the SNP have completely gone over to Greens, but that is a lot of what's going on under the hood. Yep. Now, why might we see that? I've broken the floor. Why might we see that? There's a couple. I'm just going to stand. Why might we see that? There's a couple of things going on. One is that we see a different sense of issue priorities if we look at older people and younger people. Well, I'm using the closed-ended questions that we have from February 2026. So these are the top 5 most important issues cited by young people and by old people. And if we actually look at the issues and we do old people subtract young people, you can end up with no, young people subtract old people. Then you end up with no, it is old people. You end up with a scale that tells you which issues are really seen as important for older people, those are the red ones, and which issues are really seen as important for younger people. And the larger the bar, the bigger the age gap in terms of the issue salience of that issue. So if we look at that, what we can see is that older members of the electorate are particularly concerned about independence and immigration. Now, the salience of independence doesn't necessarily mean you're supportive of independence, right? It's the salience of the constitutional issue. And then cost of living is particularly an issue for young people, as is the environment. And that helps us to kind of understand the trends in demographic support that we see. Another thing that we know is that there has been a changing salience of independence preferences. So we can look at how strongly you identify as a yes supporter, and we can look at SNP support among those different types of identifiers. And what we can see is that SNP support fell across every category. So it fell among the very strong yes supporters, the moderately strong yes supporters, and the not very strong yes supporters. But the gap is largest in those who are not very strong yes supporters. So there's a changing salience of independence that is also having a role here. And then the last thing I want to do is talk about economic uncertainty. Obviously, the cost of living, if you put it in a closed-ended question, it goes to the top of the list in terms of the most important issue facing Scotland, but it has a different impact in terms of driving your support to different parties based on whether you are the youngest members of the data set, in the middle, or the oldest. And for the youngest members of the data set, going from a position of economic security or economic certainty to economic uncertainty changes you and makes you more supportive of Greens and more supportive of reform. But for the oldest members of our data set, as you move from someone who is economically certain to economically uncertain, and it's a prospective measure about the next 12 months, then you are overwhelmingly likely to see an increase in support for reform for that group. Last, what can we expect moving forward? There's a couple of things worth mentioning on independence. Notwithstanding the fact that the salience has gone down, we do know a little bit about how people might interpret the result for a mandate. We know that only a small slice of the electorate actually sees elections as important for delivering a mandate. Of that small slice, about half would interpret a pro-Indy majority as providing enough of a mandate to move forward on a referendum. We can see a direct and an indirect effect in terms of reform. We know that reform supporters have abolishing the Scottish Parliament as their key constitutional preference. That might well change the polls of constitutional debate within the Scottish Parliament. We also know that they have very distinct preferences in terms of leadership traits. It's a rare question that makes Conservative supporters look like Green supporters in our data set, but that is one of the ones where Reform supporters have really distinct preferences. We can also see an indirect effect of reform, I would say, and quite possibly a breaking down of some of those constitutional blocks in terms of the behaviour of Labour and Lib Dem supporters. And we can also see something of a rehabilitation for Conservatives as this a weakening of the negative polarisation toward a negative partisanship towards Conservatives in the data set, in part because reform is now providing a different anchoring function in the data set.
Thank you, Ailsa. Right, thank you very much. Right, so there was at one point this grand master plan to our set of panelists, which was also doing the Scottish election study, look at what voters wanted, and then Nicola was going to come to the governance policy issue at the end, and in between, Meryl Kenny was going to talk about the sort of makeup of the new parliament. So I'm going to do my best to channel Meryl a little bit. She can't be blamed for anything I say. These aren't her slides. I just sort of came up with them this afternoon. So I'll say I'm explicitly plagiarizing some of what Meryl had in her slides, and even more so for the contributors in the room to the Scottish Election Analysis Report. I am explicitly plagiarizing what they had in their reports, and I'm just sort of summarizing some of it to give a flavor of what the new Parliament looks like. So, we've talked about the outcome a bit. I think it is, I'm sort of fixated on this crucial idea that there's 64 new members to the Parliament, many of whom have no electoral experience whatsoever, have not served in an elected body, have not served as representatives of constituents. And that's important. Now, the Scottish Parliament, and we had a Stevenson lecture previously with Alan Campbell, who's the chief or the head operations officer at the Parliament, walking us through how they were going to try to induct these new MSPs and help them sort of learn the role of being MSPs, because it's a complicated job, and it's a job with all sorts of different facets to it. Not only do they have to be representatives of their constituents, they have to be employers. They have to set up offices, which many of them haven't done before. So it's quite complex. The other crucial element of this new Parliament, of course, is that there's now 6 parties, all with members in the double digits. What that means is it provides a level of complexity for the Parliament itself and how the Parliament works. The Parliament works on it has its standing orders, and then it has its conventions. And many of those conventions are built around the idea that you have this clear pecking order of largest party, next largest, next down, down, down. And the conventions sort of work on this basis. This configuration is quite difficult. And this now means that all of the parties, for instance, could sit on the Parliamentary Bureau. They could sit on all the sort of the key institutions within the Parliament that sort of just determine how the Parliament works. Right. Now, looking at the profile of MSPs. Women in the Parliament who were elected, it's 43% of the Parliament is women. That's down a bit from 2021. And crucially, and it has been pointed out many times, 57% of those people who stood down, so who were previously MSPs and decided to stand down and not run again, were women. So you've lost a lot of institutional expertise and experience amongst women MSPs within the Parliament. And so this gives you the percentages of the new configurations of the parties by what percentage of them are women. And so just to show you the proportion of women by party over time, has bounced around a fair bit, I think is one of the key takeaways here within this graph. And obviously we have reform going from 0 to suddenly springing up to about 40-something% of their party, which is why that sort of bizarre line creeps up there. In terms of ethnic minority representation, there have been, perhaps you might say, small improvements. So 6.2% of the new batch of MSPs are from minority ethnic backgrounds. This is a slight increase over previous levels. It does span now 5 parties, the representation, and a sort of wider geographic spread. Again, much as I said for women MSPs, it's also the case that many of the senior people from ethnic minority backgrounds who stood down and didn't run again are also, so you lose that sort of expertise amongst senior people of ethnic minority backgrounds within the Parliament. In terms of disability, so people with disabilities serving as MSPs, this one's hard to calculate a little bit because there are obviously all sorts of hidden disabilities, and for many reasons people don't report disabilities that they may or may not want to reveal to the public. So it's sort of take these with, I wouldn't say a grain of salt, but take them realizing that this is of people who self-report. So it's up a little bit. at least 9 people in this parliament have declared disabilities. That's up a bit. One interesting thing is there's a scheme that basically provides extra funding for people with declared disabilities who are running for elected office. It's the Access to Elected Office Fund. And so this provides extra support. You might figure that some people might need sort of extra help paying for travel, for instance, right? And so it provides a fund to help cover those costs of personal assistance, travel, coaching, assistant technology where it's needed. And so more people apply for that this time around. And 5 of the people who were elected are people who made use of this fund. Social class, the hidden inequality. This is from one of the reports in the Scottish election analysis report. One person went directly, and so this is directly from a working class job into the parliament. Now, obviously, there will be other people who, maybe had more of a working class job and then moved into more of a professional position and then went into the parliament or something like that. So you wouldn't want to necessarily say it's strictly from backgrounds. But an interesting thing is 3 in 10 of the new MSPs previously worked in the parliament or for a party in some way. So much like Westminster, actually this probably isn't even, I don't know, John, you might know off the top of your head what the proportion is for Westminster, but I suspect it's even 30%. John's nodding, just sort of. And this speaks to the idea that one of the things that Holyrood was specifically devised for, and if you think of the founding principles of Holyrood as a chamber, was to be open and accessible and to try to represent all of Scotland. This raises the question of should class be one of the things that is considered when we think about representation more specifically. Right, so making this new, not quite what was it, 2003 Rainbow Parliament was, but this is sort of a mini Rainbow Parliament. How does this one going to work? Well, this unprecedented tie is going to cause problems, and negotiations have been going on at rapid pace to try to figure out how they're going to deal with things like even First Minister's questions. Right. So the second largest party traditionally gets the first go at asking questions. Are they going to have to sort of rotate this week on week? That's probably what they'll end up doing, but that's going to be a negotiated thing. Committee allocation and importantly, real estate. Who gets what offices in the MSP office blocks? I can guarantee you that was probably one of the first things many MSPs had on their minds and wanted to start negotiating about right off the block. So that probably started happening from the 9th on, I imagine. The 64 new members, I've already talked about those, so I'll leave that there. But just to say, so this new configuration does raise these questions about how they're going to work on legislating and how that's going to operate in this new session of Parliament. From Scottish election study data, we ask about compromise. And we ask the question, should politicians at Holyrood who share your beliefs compromise with the other side, or should they stand firm on principle? On average, across the board, 54% of people say that compromise is a good thing. But you'll notice there's a distinct partisan dynamic to this. And you can imagine that the pressures that MSPs are going to come under from their voters might be different from the pressures that they feel within the chamber to sort of move things along and strike deals, perhaps. And how well that's going to work remains to be seen and is going to be the challenges for the Parliament going forward. And I think that segues into Nicholas. So, Nicola.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. And that was not winging it at all. That was great. Thank you. So, yeah, I'm going to look at where we are now and try to sort of look at going forward at some of the challenges that the new administration faces. I won't say anything more about the result other than to note these are the things that we know, among the other things that both of our excellent speakers already contributed to. We know that the SNP lost support. We know that it won a 5th successive term. A remarkable achievement not matched by any party of UK government ever. So I think that is worth mentioning and noting. We know that there's a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament, larger than we have seen in any other parliament. And we know that that minority is facing an ideologically fragmented opposition, with a new kid on the block in the form of Reform UK. And beyond that, we don't really know too much. The final thing to note there is that this has been commented on, particularly in UK media now, that we have with the results in Wales, 2 in the election of Plaid Cymru, 3 nationalist first ministers, although in Northern Ireland, of course, it's a dual first minister role. There's equivalence between the first minister and the deputy first minister, so it's a little bit qualified in that case. These are the things we know, but we don't really know what they mean and what they will lead to. My assumption is that the minority leads to minority government rather than a confidence in supply or coalition government, but that still remains to be seen. Because we have a minority government, and of course the 58 is now 57 following the election of the presiding officer, the SNP as a minority government will have to negotiate with other parties to get business done. The most important business is the budget. So it's the budget is the crucial thing where they will have to get agreement from other parties. And it's not that difficult to do, because there are some parties who are more inclined to use the opportunity and to use their leverage to get some compromises, to get some deals, and to be able to promote and shout about, as we saw the Liberal Democrats do in the campaign, the concessions that they were able to secure in terms of government spending. In particular, because it's a minority, probably a minority government, who chairs which committee will be really important. We don't yet know. There are some committees that are mandatory, but there are some that will be for the bureau, the parliamentary bureau, where all the parties are represented, to determine, ultimately, for the parliament itself to determine. So we don't know who the conveners or deputy conveners will be, and that's clearly a critical role in the ability of the committees to hold government to account and to scrutinise the work of government. And we don't yet know how the government will govern. We should start to find out from tomorrow, I guess, who it makes up the cabinet. We are hearing it will be a smaller cabinet, more streamlined, and there are some big fish that have come into the Scottish Parliament. We don't yet know which of those will be within the cabinet itself. And we don't know if this result will mark a new era of constitutional politics. And it's to that issue that I will turn to for a moment. And this was the subject that I addressed in my contribution to the election analysis report. So we know that the SNP manifesto said that a vote for the SNP would be a vote for a referendum on independence, talking up the precedent from 2011, where an overall majority was recognised by the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, as a mandate to proceed to an independence referendum, facilitating the transfer of powers that led to the legislation underpinning that referendum. And the SNP had claimed in this election that this was the surest way for them to get a new mandate for an independence referendum. Well, they didn't get it. So, no overall majority, no mandate. Or does the fact that there is a pro-independence majority itself constitute a mandate? Again, the largest one that we have had, albeit that the share of the vote between the Greens and the SNP on the party list vote here is some way short of a majority of the population. And we've seen a little bit of back and forth about, well, there's no mandate because there was no majority, therefore we need to move on. I just think that's a red herring, because it seems to, I don't for a second think that had there been an overall majority, which was perfectly possible with a few percentage points here and there, given the quirks of the system, that we would have then been welcoming John Swinney, First Minister, to Downing Street to talk through the negotiations on the transfer of competences. Not least because the Labour government could just as easily say, well, hang on a minute, we have a mandate to oppose an independence referendum, because that's what the Labour manifesto said in 2024. So mandates, political mandates, are always going to be contested. They don't automatically lead to one thing over another. What isn't contested is that the legal authority over independence, over the Union, lies with the UK Parliament. So there is no route to independence, or even to an independence referendum, that does not go through the Westminster Parliament in one shape or another. So where does that leave the independence movement? The SNP's first 100 days document, I think it was, possibly the manifesto as well, talked about on the first sitting day after the appointment of the new government, we will hold a vote to approve a new Section 30 order to formally request that Scotland be given the power to hold an independence referendum. I expect that will still happen. I expect it will have no consequence, but it will be a symbolic statement of the strength of the pro-independence majority in the Parliament, and that's not for nothing. The manifesto also talked about setting up a constitutional convention, and I would expect to see that take place too. What I think we might see over the course of this Parliament, and particularly thinking about the First Ministers in Wales and in Northern Ireland, we might start to see a little bit more pressure to clarify what would constitute the conditions to lead to a revisiting of that question. Because the further away we get from 2014, the harder politically it is for UK parties, particularly the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, to say, you've had your decision and wished now. So what kind of government will we see? Will it be an outcome-focused government focused on delivery? And this list comes from the SNP manifesto again. I don't know how well or not you'll be able to read that writing. It's quite small, but it's a long list of things that are sort of in the business of motherhood and apple pie, and that they're lovely. You know, who doesn't want to be healthy? Who doesn't want us to be good global citizens? What they lack, so they're aspirational. What they lack is the detail on how. How will you achieve these things? So we take a healthy Scotland, the one in the pink there. The aspiration is that Scotland has a strong NHS. Great. How? And if you look at the list of commitments and pledges that were also in the manifesto, it's quite hard to see how they will achieve the change that would be needed to get to these aspirational outcomes. Each of the headings here, I think, will guide the cabinet, and we might see that filter through into perhaps even the titles of cabinet secretaries, because each of these headings are the headings from the new National Performance Framework. But to get to any of these is going to require system change, something much more than can be achieved by a fairly random list of pledges, including these ones, which were in, it's not a complete list, but it's most of the things that were in the first 100 days document. The pledges, again, were underneath these broad banners, but it seems like a fairly random list of things. that are some way from being the kind of things that we might want to see to push the radical change that you would need in order to achieve those very welcome ambitions. I'll come back to perhaps the first one listed there in a moment. What we do know is that the government is facing a hard fiscal reality. You wouldn't have heard much from the parties about this in the campaign because there was a sort of, reluctance to talk and discuss and debate this, but you would have heard lots of commentators talking about the black hole in the public finances. These charts come from the Scottish Fiscal Commission from earlier this year, and what they indicate is that the resources budget, that's the budget that the Scottish Government has at its disposal for its day-to-day spending, half of which, incidentally, is on payroll. Around 40% is on the NHS. The real terms increase in that budget is really very, very modest. Now, against the backdrop of rising inflation, rising costs, probably rising pay demands, it's going to be really difficult to meet those terms, but they have no choice. So the Scottish Government has to have a balanced budget, which means they have to be able to make hard choices and hard decisions. If you fund anything new, it has to come from somewhere else. And we weren't hearing an awful lot of that in the campaign itself. The capital funding budget is even more tricky in that the real terms projections over the next 5 years are for that budget to decline quite significantly. So it's a really, really difficult fiscal environment for the government, which might be why we are seeing policy commitments that are not so much about spending lots more to tackle inequality or poverty or achieve that aspiration of a fairer outcome, but regulatory commitments. And the most notable of these was the commitment in the campaign that seemed to come out of the blue that the SNP made to introduce legislation for having legal limits on the price of a basket of essential nutritional foods, of between 20 and 50 essential food items only at large supermarkets. Now, I'm not going to comment on, I'm not qualified to comment on whether that's a good policy or not a good policy for from a social policy perspective or a business perspective. That's not my area of expertise. Although it seemed to come out of the blue in Scotland, it's not untried elsewhere. So it looks very like a similar policy that the Croatian government introduced and has been operating for a few years on a much larger list of items. But the Croatian government is the government of a nation state. It's not a devolved government. So my interest in this is around the constitutional dimension and whether or not it is a policy that can be delivered. So let me just talk you through some of that, because there are a series of questions that will have to be addressed. First, is it within devolved competence? Is the legislation that is to be proposed within devolved competence? Probably, but there are some things that would need to be, it would depend on how it was drafted, but there are areas, for example, of consumer protection that are mainly reserved in the devolution settlement. But I think that's why we've heard the First Minister, now First Minister can call him that again, talk about the health, using public health powers to introduce this legislation, because that's an attempt to pivot it more towards things that are indisputably devolved. So let's assume it is within devolved competence. Will it be subject to the market access principles of the United Kingdom Internal Market Act? And you've probably heard this being mentioned. There are two market access principles in that legislation around mutual recognition and non-discrimination. And essentially, that act doesn't stop the Scottish Parliament from passing legislation within its area of competence, but it might stop it being able to deliver it in any meaningful way. And it might make it subject to challenge if there can be claims, not necessarily on the part of the UK government, but on any business or anybody who is affected by it, that it creates an unfair market distortion. So when the SNP has said they want to make sure they are calling for the UK government not to block it, they wouldn't have to block it. What I think that means is that they would apply for an exclusion from the UK Internal Market Act. So again, will it create adverse market effects for incoming goods? I think it probably would, in which case it would fall foul of those market access principles. In the legislation itself, it's possible to have a workaround where you can make the case that the legislation would qualify as a necessary means of achieving a legitimate aim, narrowly defined to include, in this case, the protection of human health. That could be a stretch. The exclusion request is likely to lead to a common framework agreement on public health grounds, but that would have to be negotiated with all of the other governments, including with the UK government. And will the refusal of such an agreement create a constitutional stushy, which some have suggested perhaps that was the purpose all along? I don't know if that was the purpose, but I doubt it, because there have been numerous constitutional stushies of this nature, and I think they have diminishing returns. So I will leave you with this last question that I will just leave for you to ponder and not answer myself. Might there have been better ways? Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Right, thank you very much. Thank you, Ailsa. Whilst you're thinking of questions, I'll say two things. One, it always happens in Stevenson lectures. It's now like the golden rule that you wait until I say, right, we have time for one more question, and then half the hands in the room go up. So think of your questions early if you could, so I can keep track of them. The other thing I would say while you're thinking of questions is I would plug another Stevenson lecture that we had earlier. Yes, I'm not going to do this a lot. By Professor Graham Roy, who's chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission. And so if because Nicola's absolutely right, the roadblock in the black hole, or whatever analogy you want to use, of the budgetary situation is going to be the massive driver of policy in this coming session. If you want to understand how the budget process works a little bit better, because it is kind of complex, I'd recommend you to look at Graham Roy's Stevenson lecture, where he does a masterful job of walking us through exactly how the budgetary process works in Scotland. Right, with that, just catch my eye for questions, and okay, start with you, sir.
I guess for Nicola, Ross. Obviously, thank you very much. Obviously, there were elections elsewhere in the UK as well, but I'm just wondering, where do the results in Scotland and Wales, and potentially in England, leave intergovernmental relations in the UK?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's important to note that the SNP government in Scotland and the Labour government in Wales already had a good, strong relationship in intergovernmental relations. They were often on the same side. They often communicated ahead of meetings. They often tried to find common cause, and where possible also with Northern Ireland as well. So the fact that we now have a Plaid Cymru government, yes, it will make that probably even more likely, but it was there before anyway. if the SNP government is expecting Plaid to sort of go strong and hard on the constitutional issue, I don't think they will. That definitely wasn't their campaign pitch. Perhaps further down the line they might, but it was very much a cost of living campaign in Wales, right? So I would be surprised if they then tried to create any sort of challenges through IGR. Of course, we're probably not going to have that much of it for a while until the sort of dramas in Downing Street resolve themselves. So maybe a more interesting question will be, well, let's see how that lands, and whether there is a new Prime Minister and whether that new Prime Minister would make any difference there. I think that there are also critical roles to play with the Secretaries of State. So intergovernmental relations with the Labour government were better for a while, but the post holder of the Secretary of State for Scotland is important in whether that is the case or not. Let's just leave it there.
I guess the other thing, Nicola, too, is you touched on it earlier about the devolved governments sort of being a bit more explicit in saying that they're going to look to work together a bit. Does that map on to this, or if so, how so, or?
Possibly. I mean, I think that the Welsh Government and Scottish Government relationship was at its strongest during the Brexit process. So it probably waned a little after that. I think we will, because they played in the SNP are sister parties, we may see more engagement, more sharing of wisdom of information, of planning, and so on.
Sorry. Wait till the microphone gets to you.
And COVID. And COVID.
I just wanted to yell, that was it. Thank you for these lovely talks. I was wondering, I mean, the Scottish government has been discussed 20 plus years ago as being a place that's encouraging more consensual share policy that's meant to build a consensus around a broad set of policies, right? Even sometimes compared to the Scandinavian Norwegian parliaments at points by some people in this room. This election seems to have put that on its end, as in minority governments are sometimes described as some of the most adversarial or majoritarian type politics you can imagine, exclusionary towards the groups. Do we perceive that the SNP is going to, will this increase polarization? Will it increase these like sort of underlying tensions that already exist? Or do we think that they're going to be able to find a way to, let's say, build consensus among them?
Do you want to take that, given your interest in tolerance? And
I mean, it's in a way, it's sort of reading the tea leaves and this sort of thing, right? I mean, there have been plenty of examples before when minority SNP government has sought to work, as you say, the famous, the SNP working with the Conservatives to get the budget over the line. Now, the trick is that the leaders are no longer those leaders, and indeed, the members of those parties are largely no longer the members of those parties as were then, right? Russell Finlay is not Annabelle Goldie in many ways, and he has sort of flagged a combative approach that he wants to take. We know that the Reform members have explicitly said that they see their role as coming into the new parliament to hold the government to account in a way that has not been done before. Thomas Kerr, one of the new elected Reform MSPs from Glasgow, has said that he wants to go in and be the bulldog in parliament and challenge forcefully the government. So, members of many of these parties, and the other thing, I guess, too, sorry, I'm going to start adding on extra points here, is many of these parties, we don't even know really how cohesive they are. Right? In the run-up to the campaign, it was certainly the case that the Greens seemed to be having some internal discussions as to sort of what they were sort of going to be about in this new parliament. Reform, many of these people in Reform who were elected, we don't know much about them, so we don't really know how they'll sort of integrate into a set. And with 64 new MSPs across all the parties, we have the sort of how are these people going to integrate and how are they going to see to work together. So that poses a challenge. The last point, I promise, is the role of presiding officer. So the role of the presiding officer is crucial in trying to make the parliament sort of grease the wheels of the parliament in many ways. Some of it's on public display, so during First Minister's questions, in the last session, the presiding officer got into a few spats with a few of the MSPs, particularly towards the end of it. It became quite fractious. People were kicked out of the chamber, et cetera, et cetera. So, is the new presiding officer going to be able to work with the MSPs and control the way that they go about trying to interrogate the government? I think we're waiting to see how Kenny Gibson's going to deal with that. It's going to be a huge challenge, I think. So I would say that that's going to be a crucial element of all of it. So that's a way of me just rambling on for a bit and not actually answering your question.
But can I say, the answer I thought you were going to give was slightly different. So and that's when I was teeing up. You ruined it. I mean, we're obviously far from new politics. Like, we are not living in the world that was envisioned by the Consultative Steering Group in terms of its new principles that the four guiding principles of the Scottish Parliament. And we are so parliamentary working culture has strayed from that new politics vision that we once had. But I think it's also fair to say that Scottish society is not necessarily where it was in 1997, 99 either. And so what I was thinking you were going to say was about the data that we have about levels of tolerance and compromise within the Scottish electorate, because we've been testing, we've been asking people about how they feel about different groups. Different groups in society, but also how they feel about different political groups, to kind of understand people's affective attachment to different groups, and then to know how tolerant people are to their least favored groups, either their social group or their least favored political group. And the answer is they are not tolerant at all. They are so we have a nested issue of a working culture that is very different from the one that was imagined, and a wider societal culture that is now far less tolerant than it was before. So we have significant levels of affective and cognitive polarization, some of which we saw an uptick specifically around constitutional blocks around the time of the independence referendum. But there was pre-existing levels of polarization on a partisan level that are now slightly different than they were before. And then layered on top of that, we also seem to have a newfound level of polarization and intolerance around certain social groups as well. So it's also not the case that there would be a driving force from outside the parliament for people inside the parliament to behave differently than they are. That's what I thought you were going to say.
Yeah, I would have gone with that had I thought of it.
Thank you. I think as Donald Rumsfeld said, there's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns, and you made a very good job of trying to get to grips with that and giving us some insights to it. But I think the thing with Reform, if we look at how they behaved, we don't know anything about how they're going to behave in Scotland, really. But if you look at how UKIP behaved in Farage's kind of general approach, it'll be interesting to see if the Scottish Reform do the same, which we might be seeing more stooshies, as you mentioned earlier, or walkouts or whatever. Just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Just to pick up on something that Chris said, I'm not sure that Malcolm Offord knows how Reform UK are going to behave in the Scottish Parliament. I think he will have a challenge in maintaining discipline in his parliamentary group, because lots of the people who have entered Parliament, they're not, as far as we are aware, a cohesive party of long-standing, of strong organisation, and that will be a challenge for him. And I think there is a spectrum of people within Reform UK, some of whom are maybe there because they are, hate the fact that income taxes are higher, are, championing low tax economic growth, oil and gas, away from net zero. Others may be much more concerned about levels of immigration. And I'm not sure that you always get both of these things within the same individuals. So there will be some decisions for the leadership of that group to decide where they pitch themselves, what they champion within the Scottish Parliament, and for the other parties as well, to how much they are willing to or want to align. This is going back to the point about how Parliament uses its leverage in the context of minority government. It can be tricky for political parties in the opposition that are not reform to choose to align or to actively align in trying to oppose or cause problems for the Scottish government. So I think there's so much that we don't know yet, and we'll just have to wait and see how things evolve.
And I think we're in the unusual position of knowing far more about reform voters than we do about reform reform representatives. And I mean, parties are often unified on one issue and then broad churches on another. So if we think back in the, in the 80s, I suppose the SNP would have been fairly united in terms of its approach to independence, but a broader church perhaps than it is now in terms of its economic left-right placement. Labour much more unified in terms of its centre-left economic placement, but at the time was a broader church in terms of constitutional preferences. Reform, from what we can tell, it seems to be united in terms of its views of immigration, but a broader church on a range of other issues. What we do know about supporters, when we ask them specifically why they voted reform in this election, or why they were planning to vote reform in this election, the most popular option by far is they are the only party serious about tackling immigration. We will leave aside the fact that the Scottish Parliament does not have jurisdictional competence over. I mean, it can manage migrant settlement, but not over numbers of migrants. But the next most popular options were really anti-politics options. One of them phrased very bluntly as they can't be any worse than anyone else, right? So there's a real sense of anti-politics frustration coming out of this. But what the policy content of that would be is less clear. And one thing that's absolutely notable, though, and one thing that distinguishes reform support in Scotland from reform support in England, is how unimportant Brexit is as a driver of reform support. And what we don't know is whether it is equally unimportant for reform representatives in the Scottish Parliament. But we are down in the small single digits of individuals who say they're voting reform because they feel Brexit's in danger. Whereas when we ask comparable questions in England, it is a much more salient feature of Brexit support, of reform support in England.
Yeah, I'll just chime in to say, so Ailsa's already mentioned earlier in her remarks that, I don't remember the percentage off the top of my head of reform supporters who said that, but I think it's definitely the plurality, who said that their preferred constitutional position is abolishing the Scottish Parliament.
It's over 40%.
I'm sorry?
It's over 40%.
Over 40% of reform supporters who say that their preferred constitutional position is abolishing the Scottish Parliament. At the same time, you may recall that during the campaign, Nigel Farage teased out the idea that it possibly could be in favor of an independence referendum sort of down the road, not right now, but sort of down the road. So we sort of have this sort of, so let's get rid of the Scottish Parliament, but maybe we'll have independence referendum. How does that sort of work? And then, so there's that lack of clarity within reform, and Ailsa's exactly right. We know more about the voters from surveys than we do about the people who were elected. But I think the other sort of issue here, and both Nicola and Ailsa have referred to it a bit, is the other parties saying locking out reform, and that's specifically the language that's been used. We want to lock out reform, which I've had a debate with colleagues over this. Personally, I would say that's a mistake. Of course, my thing is compromise and working with institutions and tolerance and all this sort of stuff that Ailsa has landed on me. So I'm the person in our discussions who keeps saying, we need to ask about compromise more. So, but I would say, locking out a party is effectively also telling the 383,000 people who voted for that party on the list, we don't think your vote really should count to how we work in the Scottish Parliament. You're excluded. It's not just the MSPs who were elected, but you're also telling their supporters, nope, you're not part of the conversation of how we govern Scotland, which I think is problematic. That's why
I agree with you, and I know you did too, because we had a WhatsApp chat about this. And I'm really, it goes back to a point that Ailsa mentioned in the presentation. The other really fascinating thing for me is about how that goes alongside the rehabilitation, not just among voters, but among parties of the previously toxic Tories. So an invitation was extended to the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party. Of course, he rejected it, and that's fine, but not to the leader of Reform UK. And I just find that really bizarre, actually, and also, like you, kind of disrespectful of voters, however much you may choose to disagree.
Right, John next, and then we'll come back over to this side.
Separate questions for Nicola and Ailsa. Thank you, Nicola, for going through the politics and the legality of the government's idea on using the public health legislation to try and cut prices. One other thing that is clearly an important feature of the SNP manifesto is, I think there's a little line that said public service reform, which actually means trying to reduce the size of the public sector in Scotland quite significantly. Wonder if I could invite you to think about how the politics of that might play out, and how realistic it's going to be to achieve. But of course, it's crucial to try to deal with the budget problem you referred to. To Ailsa, one of the purposes of holding Scottish elections is meant to enable democracy in Scotland to be more sensitive to and reflective of the needs and wishes of the people of Scotland. So thinking about this election, would you say that this was indeed primarily an election result that was determined in Scotland? Or was this really an election that was primarily determined south of the border?
Shall I go first?
If you've got an answer ready, I've got an answer ready, but you can go.
Well, you go first, because I might want to come in on yours as well.
So it's fundamentally, was this a first order election, like in the sense of, was this a Scottish election? And the answer is yes, it was. And we know that because the voters told us that. We have asked people since 2007 whether they are casting their ballot predominantly based on issues that are happening, based on what's going on in Scotland or what's going on in the UK. And we're over 2/3 in this election. It's gone up every single election. We're up, in the high 60s for people saying, yeah, we were casting a ballot based on what was happening in Scotland. That said, there are variations across the parties, but the only party that is distinct there is Reform. So Reform was the only party where there were more people saying that they were casting a ballot based on what was going on in the UK rather than what was going on in Scotland. But for everyone else, this was a first order devolved election, I would say. And then moving aside from the data in terms of what people have been telling us, also, if you looked at the campaign material that was coming out, it was actually not bad in light of recent elections in terms of focusing on records in office, in devolved office. When parties were arguing with one another in debates, it was often on the basis of how parties had performed in Holyrood rather than how parties had performed in Westminster. Because as we can have Westminster campaigns in Scotland where people are complaining about the SNP's record in Holyrood, and no vote in a Westminster election is going to change whoever's in office in Holyrood. So in terms of a blurring of the lines point as well, separate from the data point, I would say, yes, this is an election about what was happening in Scotland for the Scottish voters. Because I believe them when they tell me that.
It was like 73% of the SNP people said it was mostly what's going on in Scotland. somewhere between 62 and 65 for Labour, Lib Dems, and Conservatives, and then 55% of Reform, who said that they were voting based on UK, not Scotland. Now, one thought I had was, well, that's because everybody who says UK has already left Labour. The reason Labour might look low there is because they've left Labour and they've gone to Reform, or they've left the Conservatives and they've gone to Reform. So I did that analysis of people who said that they previously voted for Conservatives or Labour, and who now say that they support Reform. Do those people, are they more on the pro-UK side? And no, they're split actually 50-50 between Scotland and Reform. So it's actually people who switched to Reform in previous elections, who said that they were particularly voting based on what's going on in UK rather than Scotland. Sam, so if you come down, sorry, Nicola.
Yes, sorry. So public service reform, all of the parties, this is actually one area potentially for compromise. All of the parties were talking up the importance of public service reform, but they didn't necessarily mean the same thing by that. So we know that John Swinney wants to reduce the size of the core civil service. We know that the Permanent Secretary is committed to that as well. We also know that there is more likelihood that they will bring more public in-house, because there's also a problem with the gap between making a decision and its implementation. And yet the accountability lies with ministers, but they don't necessarily have oversight over what happens in the wider, what's often referred to as the wider Scottish Government family. Quite how you reconcile these two things, I am not sure. How you reduce the size of the civil service and simultaneously expand it by bringing more things in-house. I hope very much that public service reform is not just shorthand for cuts, not least because I don't think there will be that many cuts from public service reform, because suggesting that you can scrap a body suggests that it's not doing anything that needs to be done, and I don't believe that's the case for the most part. So some of that work will still need to be done, and the trade unions will probably have something to say about any government is intent on going really firm and hard on reducing public bodies and reducing the jobs that go with it. I hope that public service reform is also much more about changing the way that government operates, changing the way that it does things so that it can get beyond the sort of departmental and budgetary silos that I think are a problem, and preventing government itself from being able to tackle challenges. And the final thing to say on that is prevention. Jesus, we've been talking about it for years. And I think that the fiscal data that I showed there means that it's really difficult to ignore now, because of what we know from not just the next 5 years, but the next 50 years of the demographic prospects that are really making it very difficult to see this all being sustainable. So hopefully it's a much bigger picture than just cutting.
Can I just follow up on what something you mentioned, Chris? So I think the fact that reform voters were much more likely to say they were voting based on what was happening in the UK. One interpretation of that is that they know full well that immigration is reserved and not devolved, and so that could be playing a role there. But the other caveat to all of that is that we know that UK Labour got a kicking in this election, and so Scottish Labour's performance is partly down to Scottish Labour and partly down to UK Labour. We will understand the percentages of that slightly better in about a week. But if we look at previous Labour voters in 2024, and then we looked at their evaluations of UK Labour, and then we look at whether they were planning on voting Labour before, among those with the dimmest view of UK Labour, only about 7% were planning on casting a ballot for Labour again in this election. And if you look at the equivalent figures for former SNP supporters and their evaluations of Scottish Government's performance in office, because we know that's taken a kicking as well, more than double that amount were planning on voting SNP again. So both were paying costs of governing, but UK Labour was paying far heavier costs among a more restricted set of the electorate than was the case for the SNP.
Right, Sam, you'll be happy to hear that we have a cluster right here, and we have about 10 minutes left, so we're going to try to sort of keep it. So come down to the third there, and then, yep, right there you go. And then we'll go to the back, and then we'll go to that side, and then we'll go across. So you can stay there, basically.
My question is for Ailsa. An invitation to reflect more on your point of the SNP losing support among younger voters, especially women, and the Scottish Green Party gaining younger voters, especially women. I understand the different issue preferences and political party preferences by age, but are we seeing some more divergences there that you'd like to comment on? And as a layperson, are some young women in Scotland getting more left-wing? And what's happening with our young men?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to take a cluster of questions?
No, go ahead. We'll do.
I mean, I think there's a couple of things going on. One is decreased salience of independence for the electorate as a whole, but particularly among younger voters. So we look at the generational graph of, this is my colleague Fraser's favorite graph, is the one of the generational support for independence. And we know that the youngest generations are more supportive of independence than older generations are. However, issue salience is not exactly the same, right? And so notwithstanding constitutional preferences, it's playing a different role in terms of voting decisions on the day. So that's part of what's going on. So we have this trend data in our Scoop trackers, or Scottish Opinion Monitor trackers, and it's closed-ended questions. And a lot of the issues are fairly static salience, either static and low or static and high. There's not much change. There are three that have gone down, and one of them is independence. The salience of independence has decreased from 2021 to 2026. Brexit is another one, and one that has gone up. One of the few that has gone up, salience of immigration. In terms of the environment. For the electorate as a whole, salience for that is slightly down, but among younger members of the electorate, it is up. And we can also see that difference in that graph I had about the issue salience across age groups. So it is particularly important for young people relative to old people. So I wouldn't interpret anything other than a decreased salience of independence and an increased salience of environment, moving people from one pro-indie party to another. So they wouldn't feel like they're betraying the constitutional bloc in a way by casting a ballot in that way. In terms of what's happening with young men, one thing that's not happening with young men is this kind of manosphere thing that we were told to look out for. We see no evidence of that in our data set. Our young men are not markedly more left-wing. We don't have an awful lot in there to test about gender attitudes, I don't think. But we're seeing support among the youngest men in our electorate we're seeing a shift towards Greens and in healthier numbers than for Reform, for example. We were told to look out for a massive shift of young men, 16 to 24, towards the Reform Party. There is a sizable proportion of it, but not like a massive swing. I don't know if John's agreeing with me or
Yes,
disagreeing.
absolutely.
Okay, good.
The whole thing about young men going to the fore is completely nothingness.
Yes, good. I've got confirmation that I'm right, so that's all I want. That's all I want.
Right, I'm looking at time, so we will take the last three. We'll go ahead and take all the questions, and then we'll respond to them to make sure you get it. So in the back there.
Thanks. Been following the seminars closely. Insightful, amazing. So thanks for hosting them. Just quickly, kind of coming off the back of that question, it's been interesting over the last year. We've seen a kind of challenge towards these SNP top-down narrations of nationalism. First time we've seen it challenged, the satire being appropriated towards anti-immigrant sentiment. So coming on to this, have we seen a change from the constitution issue being the number one, and then immigration being the more salient question recently in this election? And also, I'm interested in the voice that kind of wasn't there in this election, with Alba not being present at elections. Have we seen a changeover from SNP voters maybe drifting towards right-wing parties such as Reform? I couldn't really see in the slide because the colours were a little bit difficult. So yeah, have we seen a kind of shift over from SNP to Reform and the change of the constitution question towards immigration?
Right, and gentleman right here.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, given the fact that governments across the world have faced like a massive anti-incumbency kind of force in recent years, plus what you were saying as well with the fact that the constitution and independence is a much less salient issue than it was, why is it that the SNP have managed to achieve that 5th term and still with quite an impressive number of seats at 58 out of 65 that they needed for a majority?
Thank you. And then finally,
this is kind of a more broad one, but I feel like I knew so many people, especially around my age group, who didn't vote. And I just wondered why you thought that was. Why have we seen the voter turnout go down, and why is it so bad, basically?
so we'll obviously end on the happy question. Ailsa and Nicola.
Can I come in now? I'll leave the turnout and voting patterns questions for Ailsa, but just on immigration and the constitution or independence, I mean, both of these are reserved matters, right? Both of them are matters that in terms of legislation are dealt with by the UK Parliament. But in another respect, they're both quite similar in that for the parties that are most concerned with them, they're not simply about the legality of independence or the legality of immigration. They are a broader lens through which to consider other issues. So I think we will start to see in parliamentary debates on homelessness or housing entitlement or entitlements to various other public services, and we're already seeing it in terms of one of the elected representatives about where immigration status aligns with other kinds of entitlement that are very much within devolved context. And where I see the similarities is that obviously the SNP is the independence party, but it links its constitutional position to all sorts of other public policy issues and uses that constitutional framework through which to debate and discuss some of the many other public policy issues. I just find that an interesting parallel. Ailsa will pick up on what the data is saying on the question of why has the SNP managed to apparently buck the trend. And I think it is because we're still seeing the prevalence, I think, of constitutional blocks as drivers for voting behaviour. Yes, it's changing a little bit, but we are still seeing that being, even though the issue itself is not as salient as in previous campaigns, it still appears to be an issue that drives votes. And that's a challenge for the Labour Party because it's sort of in the union bloc, but it's kind of not going to ever capture that to the same extent as Reform now and the Conservatives. So it's never really been, and Labour's aspiration, I think, was always to just park the constitutional issue and talk about the SNP's record. Why is not everybody talking? But I think there is a big space between independence and the union as currently constituted that no political party is occupying, and there are opportunities there, but there's no interest there at the moment. And I think the persistence of those blocks to a degree is part of what is explaining what apparently appears to be not just bucking a trend, but also re-election, despite the fact that public opinion on the SNP's record in public services had diminished quite significantly.
Yes.
So it's a cost of governing question. Why is the SNP not been paying the costs of governing? And I think there's a wider cost of governing answer, and then there's a what happened in 2026 in particular answer. And we have an article that is my responsibility to finish, and it's not quite there yet, but John saw a version of it last May. So our argument is that there's three things explaining why the SNP has not been paying the cost of governing to the extent that it has caused them to lose elections. One is that they are constantly floated by the degree of constitutional support there is for yes. So in a binary world of referendum preferences, translating that into a multi-party world means that the SNP just starts ahead from the basis of support from people who want independence. The second thing is that in a context in which salience for the constitutional issue is high, then standing up for Scotland and being perceived to stand up for Scotland more than any other party is perceived to stand up for Scotland has become a valence issue in its own right, in the way that managing the economy is a valence issue for parties in government in any other context, right? And in fact, arguably has become more important as a valence issue for the SNP than has managing the economy. The second is that in a multi-level world, the third is that in a multi-level world, there is a constant evaluation of blame and reward for policy successes and failures. And in that context, the SNP does not have to be better than its rivals in Scotland, but just has to claim that it is better than the UK government in Westminster in order to win that blame game. And so therefore it has a competence advantage on standing up for Scotland and a perceived competence advantage in terms of being perceived to handle things better than the UK government. And that, coupled with yes support, is what gives them an easier run at the cost of governing. That's the argument. In 2026, we also know three things were relevant. One, they were helped by Reform's decision to stand in every single constituency. That further split the unionist vote. And it in particular detracted from this pattern we had seen, which was a shift towards extreme two-party contests in constituencies where other pro-union parties saw their support depleted below 10 percentage points, so as to give the pro-union party with the best chance of defeating the SNP the strongest possible support. The arrival of Reform completely disrupted that, and this pattern we had seen of ever-increasing extreme two-party contests completely fell away in this election. Second, they were helped by Green's decision not to stand in every constituency. We know that had they stood in more constituencies, and particularly had they performed half as well as their worst performance, which was in Shetland at 8 percentage points. In other words, had they achieved 4 percentage points in a range of other constituencies, that would have denied the SNP 7 seats. Greens wouldn't have won the seat, but that would have been enough to take support away from the SNP to hand the seat to other people. And those are evocative seats. You know, it's Banffshire and Buchan Coast, it's Eastwood, the East Lothian Coast and Lammermuirs, for example. And the other thing we know helped the SNP in this election, the last thing I'll say, is that the UK government now is less popular among Scots than Boris Johnson's was at the time of the 2021 election. So if you have all of those three things in 26 layered on top of the pre-existing advantage they have from a cost of governing perspective, that's why we saw the result that we got.
Right. And now we need the last question.
Turnout. You can do that.
Turnout.
Turnout.
Yeah, for youth.
You can go.
Right. We're pushing it. That's right. So start off with, and a sort of crucial element to say is that the sorts of surveys that we do are not very good instruments for actually understanding the question that you're asking. Right. So I'll plug our colleagues at the John Smith Center, the youth poll that the John Smith Center runs. They also conduct focus groups, which actually perhaps are better ways of getting into sort of some of the reasoning behind why people choose to participate or not to participate. Because the problem with our surveys is that people who don't vote also don't respond to our surveys. And so it does tend to be slightly problematic. That said, there's generally a sense amongst younger people that governments just basically aren't listening to them, right? And this is highly problematic. That lack of connection is real and palatable. So they also had the issue, for instance, previously. It was environment and cost of living were the biggest issues amongst the younger people in our sample. And arguably, this, as Nicola said, this was not an election where people were saying, here's how we're really going to deal with the cost of living sorts of issues, and here's how we can connect to you. Housing, another big issue. Education, the state of universities, all these sorts of things are big issues for younger people, but not necessarily the big target issues for policy purposes. You want
No,
anything?
that's right.
Anything else to come in on that? Right, so, sorry, we pressed our time well past where we should have. As we wrap up, a couple of things to say. Many of the issues that we addressed tonight are in the Scottish Election Analysis Report, you'll be surprised to hear. If you didn't get the QR code, there are flyers on the table on the way out the door that you can get to download that. Please share it if you could. Also, the plug for the Center for Public Policy website and its webinars and the analysis reports that they've put out have been really good in helping to understand how this election has shaped and will shape policy in the future. And then the last one, because Sam always tells me I'm supposed to remember this, and I can't find the slide, the lecture on the 2nd of June. So please remember to sign up for that one. You have to keep going a lot.
Oh, sorry.
There we go.
There.
Yay! Thank you very much.
That was me finding the right slide.
And last thing is to say thank you to Ailsa and Nicola. Thank you both very, very much. Thank you. Good evening.